So yeah, it's a biopolitical project, and women are at the center of it. And I just think about these women, just affectively, how difficult it would have been to become a wife and have children after what they experienced. So they show up in Aleppo. There's a doctor treating them in the home. I mean, they've got gonorrhea. They've they've been through it, right? And then they have to, for the sake of the nation, get married because the marriage is kind of baked into these projects. Orphans marrying other orphans, and betrothals that are also happening abroad. To these girls sometimes end up, in Canada and the United States and in France and these places married to men. And from the male perspective, and somebody in the community once said, well, look at our men. They took these women, even what they had gone through. But I'm thinking these women were sexually assaulted repeatedly over and over, maybe even as children. And they go on to birth a new generation of Armenians. I mean, have we fully taken in what that meant to them and what their bodies had been through?
Yeah, hello everyone, and welcome to the Other Armenians podcast. I'm your co-host Milena Abrahamian.
And I am your other co-host, Tamar Shirinyan.
So as always, I'm just going to remind you all to please subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, like this video, like other content, comment, share your thoughts with us, engage with us. This really helps our views and sort of the algorithm. So that's really helpful. Please do that. And Tamar will introduce our guest today.
So we are very happy today to have with us Dr. Elyse Semerdjian, a feminist historian whose work has carefully examined the social histories of the Ottoman Empire and especially the experiences of Armenian women in it. Her first book, which was a fascinating exploration of sexuality in Ottoman law, Off the Straight Path, Illicit Sex, Law, and Community in Ottoman Aleppo, was published by Syracuse University Press in 2008. Today's conversation, however, will largely be around her second and more recent book, which, as you can see here, has won many book prizes since it was published by Stanford University Press in 2023. Remnants, Embodied Archives of the Armenian Genocide is a beautiful history. I would argue that it is actually an ethnographic history, and I'm sure that Elyse would not have a problem with this, of women's experiences during and after the genocide. The book importantly challenges many of the putative assumptions about women's experiences, as well as many of the methods that we might use to understand and resurrect these experiences during the genocide. Taking on tattoos given to women and girls who were kidnapped, the use of the Armenian female body to represent genocide victims, and the afterlives of the bones left in the desert to be ritually collected for placement in makeshift as well as more official and institutional ossuaries. The book is not afraid of going to the places that many genocide scholars have left untouched, and even more importantly for this podcast, the Other Armenians podcast, is not afraid to analyze against the grain of many assumptions in Armenian and genocide studies. So Dr. Elyse Semerdjian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get into our conversation around this book. The title of it is Remnants, and you understand this concept of remnants as very material. As you define it in the introduction, doing history with remnants means, quote, thinking through and with the materiality of the body that have been discarded by the violence of traditional archives. Remnants in this way are ciphered bits of information, as you put it, that allow us to situate the material body of survivors as a repository of traumatic experience, bodies that also form sites of resistance where memory of victims are preserved by their descendants. So a major component of this archival method of looking for remnants is the role that sexual violence plays on those very bodies. So let's start by thinking about some of these forms of sexual violence that you describe in the book that are actually really hard to read about. And Milena and I were actually texting about this yesterday, and how those experiences of sexual violence have been left out of traditional or canonical accounts of the Armenian genocide.
Thanks for that question. There's a lot in there. But I would just say, like, I was very motivated by the absence of these discussions in our standard history texts. I still teach, of course, in the field of history, and every time we come to the Armenian genocide, I find myself bringing in my own material rather than relying on the textbook. We don't really have textbooks, but like the text we're using as a textbook, because, there will be maybe even just a sentence or two, women and children died. But they weren't really telling you why or how that was significant to know. I mean, isn't there more to know than that? And of course, this is a common refrain. I think a lot of it has to do with kind of framing the victim as innocent, the innocence of women and children. But we don't really get into sort of the deeper analysis that we could get from, for example, Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian's concept of unchilding, that helps us understand, why it is that children, for example, in the occupied territories are targeted the way they are. What would it look like if that conversation were brought into Armenian studies? And I would say also sexual violence is, the most difficult thing to narrate. Perhaps the most stark example is that I was really looking for male sexual violence against men. This is something I don't think the community has really narrated, and yet it was in a kitchen in Chicago in 2013 that I heard an elderly woman say, well, everyone knows what happened to Rupen. Well, what happened to Rupen? And Rupen actually narrated it later in life, and it was by far the hardest thing is to hear an elderly man narrate how he was raped by a Kurdish man in a barn when he was a barn hand in that family, taken in and working the barns like so many stable boys, actually. So it made me think, okay, Rupen was brave, but I can tell you I haven't found any narration like Rupen's. And yet we now know, especially with last week's news, sexual violence against women and men and children. These are things that I think we need to narrate, but it's so difficult for people to narrate firsthand. And I know that we in this room also know, Elaine Scarry and what happens to words when we're talking about torture. And of course, some of these extreme tortures and genocide have made it difficult for people to narrate. So what we're left with is this kind of fragmentary archive, but we can still work with it. But I wanted to recognize that it's fragmentary by talking about the material missing bodies in the archive as well as the actual material bodies of victims. And then also critique the archive, because that, my friends, I don't think that's happening enough in the field of Armenian studies and in Ottoman studies, where the Ottoman archive in particular is continually looked to as the repository of knowledge. It is where claims of genocide will be made. And so veering into Armenian writings and also photography, the evidence left behind of these women's bodies in photography, including the tattoo symbols, which are also telling a layer of the story, was one way that I tried to get around this impossibility of fully narrating. I mean, the narrative's there, but it's smashed. And the original version of the book was actually a smashed book. I wanted the book to be, it was 30 chapters, it was fragmentary, it was like a scrapbook. I wanted the reader to be able to start at the beginning or the end or in the middle and kind of flip through it. And it didn't go over well in academic publishing, so I had to rewrite the book in a different way. Mm-hmm.
Part of the and it's interesting that you say that you started with wanting to find men's experiences of sexual violence, because that is even rarer, of course, than discussions of women's experiences with sexual violence. But there's this dimension of shame, as if to preserve the innocence of the victim, and this is usually about women, there has to be a kind of, we just assume we know that certain things happen to her, happen to them, but we won't talk about those things because in some way it robs them of the innocence that we need to commemorate genocide. And so there's this like extra layer of violence that gets added in the commemoration process where we don't want to remember certain things because they're shameful things. But then there's also this other thing that happens where we all just assume that sexual violence happened to women. And I guess on the same order, we just also assume that sexual violence did not happen to men, or that it was something that predominantly happened to women. And I find your discussion, many of your discussions, and we'll get into some of this today, in some ways like refuse those narratives. They refuse, for example, that sexual violence always happened, because it didn't always happen, or that some things that we might even deem sexual violence are a little bit more ambiguous. But it also refuses that shame around the body, right? It insists on, and you take up the body as the site in which you will write about and remember genocide. So that's really interesting.
Definitely. I mean, the shame, I think it's really important. This is where reading, some Sarah Ahmed and, was very useful to think about, shame and what is shame really. And, you have this sense that these women, they survived unthinkable things and they escaped, and then they joined the Armenian community in places like Aleppo and Constantinople, and especially if they had tattoos. But also just generally, they were wearing the stigma and the way people looked at them. So it's almost like people were looking at me in a certain way, is how they describe it. One of your questions I know will ask about Aravni Kabakyan, who left a very in-depth testimony of her tattooing, describes when she arrived in Constantinople, people were looking at her funny, but it's also because these traditions were not of the city. So even for Turks, they were foreign. To city Turks, they were foreign. But the shame starts to set in, and it causes these women to go to great lengths to remove their tattoos or reframe themselves to be acceptable. And sometimes they're never quite accepted. I would say also there are cases in which women were not sexually violated. I know many who arrived in Karen Yapé's home were. In fact, she says only one girl who arrived had not been sexually abused, and that's out of the 2,000 boys and girls that she rescued. But she doesn't speak of any kind of sexual violence against the boys, and it's, extremely taboo in that period of time to talk about it, and yet it tracks with the kind of, I think of it as a mode of communication that's happening with women's bodies and boys and men's bodies in the course of genocidal violence. These sexual atrocities are a form of communication, they're a form of power and subjugation as well. And so it certainly tracks with the way that genocide plays out. But how do you work around that taboo? And the men's stories and boys' stories, I think, have really yet to be fully told.
Yeah, and you mentioned last week's news, and I'm assuming you're talking about that New York Times article, or it was an opinion piece, because the New York Times will only, allow an opinion piece to be written about systematic rape in Israeli military prisons where Palestinians are kidnapped and tortured in. And the interesting thing about that article, opinion piece, is the way in which the author actually had to go and find victims and ask them to tell him their stories. And some of those stories are by men who initially, out of a kind of desire to make known these horrible atrocities that are taking place in these concentration camp-like prisons, right, wanted to tell their stories and wanted their names to be printed, but then later wanted their names redacted. And it's this kind of, which then raises questions about sourcing, which of course brings up all kinds of questions about the archive, right? What ends up, right? What kinds of narratives end up in the archive are really important things to think about. And sexual violence is one of those things, because it's been haunted by the shame, this thing that happens to one, that one it carries with them, and the humiliation that comes with it for the rest of their lives, that this is something that doesn't often end up in the archive. And so the archive then limits the scope of what kinds of stories will be known in the future as well as in the present.
Yeah, it's kind of unbelievable, right? But not much has changed with regard to the shame that it carries, especially for men. I mean, because as I'm describing with genocidal processes, you have to, I mean, it tracks perfectly to the contemporary terror wars and the targeting of male bodies, especially Muslim male bodies, but targeting of male bodies as de facto terrorist bodies, thinking about Jasper Poir and that they need to be neutralized, they need to be feminized, you know. So there is this kind of active feminization of the population with the idea that it will neutralize. And it's also, I would say, you know, New York Times also quickly, the very next day, I think, published, you know, cases of, rape on the, committed allegedly by Hamas members. So we have this kind of back and forth that rape becomes this kind of course it happens in times of war. It's not something I think that any sensible person should deny, but now it's being used in this way in the media to sort of make political claims or claims of innocence or claims of, I personally don't know how anyone also denies that we have actually videotape and video footage of these types of atrocities taking place on a level that, of course, did not exist in earlier periods of time.
Yeah.
So the archive is rich, and yet the denial is always ever present, as it is in the case of Armenians, because for many Turkish denialists, these Armenian women, they're just wives. They're just wives, and there's something about their incorporation into the patriarchal household that is it's an attempt to kind of take one form of violence, which to me is the patriarchal household, and use it as a cover for this other form of genocidal violence. I mean, Halide Adib, the Turkish feminist, also says these are just wives. These are not slaves. These are not concubines. These Armenian women are just Turkish wives now. So it was resolved in her mind.
But that question is also interesting, and this reminds me, in many ways, the kind of archiving work, and especially to bring women and women's bodies back into the story that you're doing in the book, is relevant to understand some of the other missing archives of other historical tragedies, catastrophes. And I'm thinking particularly about partition, right? And one of Urvashi Batalia has written this book on the silences around partition in India, and the way in which women were kidnapped, and of course also sexually violated on both sides, both in Pakistan and in India. And in many cases, right, when the two states agreed for the wives and the children to go back to their proper families, their proper Hindu or Muslim families, many of those women and children did not want to go. And this was something that Milena and I were also talking about yesterday. Like, she was.
I mean, I'm so overwhelmed because I've had such a hard time reading this book, Elyse, that like you're all going so fast in this conversation. I understand that it's possible to do that. It's just I'm also kind of digesting it emotionally, psychically, bodily. So, yeah.
So you had quoted, an often overlooked aspect of these rescues is how even Armenian rescuers were sometimes met with fear and uncertainty rather than recognition by their traumatized compatriots. Almas is a prime example of a child who had, in her own retelling, began to love her adoptive family. She described the separation from her second family as terrifying and traumatic. I cried, just like when I lost my mother and father. Almas, who was about 11 at the time of rescue, would have never left the home of her adoptive parents if she had been given the choice. Generally speaking, children were not viewed as being capable of such a choice. their Islamization conducted by force was officially annulled by international treaty, which was enforced when possible by humanitarians. And that's particularly about children, which of course is different than women being taken as wives. But it does raise this question of, you know, the assumption that once someone is taken to live in another community, in another home, by different religious practices and cultural practices, that will automatically be foreign to them and like foreign to their body in some way, and that they will definitely want to leave that context and go back to the one that is more natural to them. But we see in some of these, in some of the cases that you bring up in your book, and we also see in some other contexts, like in partition and the kind of repatriation that takes place across borders when the states agree to return wives and children, that wives and children very often do not want to return because they have found a home. And what that tells us about, even, of course, right, the kidnapping a woman and taking her as a wife is, of course, a form of violence and slavery, but that can often also really create a new context and a new home. Even if,
I mean, we also forget that also the patriarchal structure of Armenian society was such that in places in and around Van, children were already betrothed at age 10, 12 years old, sometimes even married at age 12. So there was already this tradition where I think agency over marriage likely didn't really exist for many Armenians. And then you have on top of it this reincorporation into another patriarchal setting, but it's after disaster. Rupan Herian, the humanitarian that I have a document translated, that talks about all the reasons why Armenian women did not leave. And he cites some of them, from what they saw, they thought all Armenians were dead and that it was just a rumor that Armenians were still alive. And some of them tried to leave and they were severely beaten when they tried to leave. Others wanted to leave but couldn't, didn't have the means. Some of them, and then there's this, I think it's a major part of the story that you're highlighting, Tamar, which is that people bond with each other. And from the Arab Muslim point of view, especially some of the stories that I share, I mean, they viewed themselves as rescuing these girls, even though I know that they were, in many cases, in these households, abused in multiple ways. These households viewed themselves as rescuing, as humanitarians. We don't have to buy that, but that's the narrative among these families. So, they were rescuing these girls. They were offering them homes and safety and food and shelter. And so in the view of Rupan Herian, these women come to this reasoning, why would I leave if at least here I get, chorhats, I get dry bread. Here, why would I leave and be vulnerable once again? So they're basically weighing these options, and maybe none of them are particularly good, but one is more stable than the other, or the not knowing what the future brings. I mean, Harian would bring photographs that would show children well-dressed and well-fed to prove to the children that indeed there's safety outside of these four walls that people have found themselves in the course of genocide. And yeah, I mean, I think it matters that they bond. And Almas lost her parents and bonded. And Almas Bogosian, she wanted to share her story with me 15 years ago, but I didn't think I would ever write a book like this, so I didn't interview her. But I found scraps of footage from different interviews she did before she passed away. And she wanted to tell her story about how this family in Suwar, which is right outside of Deir ez-Zor, had treated her really well, and how traumatized she was when she left them because it was a form of safety. And I speculate, based on her story, that perhaps it might have been Herian who rescued her himself, based on the description of the wagon and some of the features. He had a wagon with food and a nurse, and they'd sort of show up dressed like a Bedouin and buy back with gold Armenians from these households, offering the gold as, in his view, like a gratitude for having taken such good care of these Armenians. But it's all complex. And I wanted to offer that complexity with cases like Almas.
I think one of the complexities for me is also there was a story about a girl who was rescued who kept denying that she's Armenian. And at some point, I think her aunt came and they recognized each other. And she felt such intense shame that she covered her face when faced with one of the women in the place where she was rescued. And I really like that struck me so much because it's such a there's so much deep sort of trauma there, and so many layers of trauma that kind of play a role in that shame. And I was also throughout my, like, as I was reading the book and seeing moments of, you know, sort of when when you're talking about how Armenians were portrayed as traitors, and like this whole narrative about Armenians as traitors, I just found that very interesting to read. And to also, I mean, I live in Armenia, and I'm part of this context, and I've heard my whole life this sort of term referred by Armenians to our other Armenians. I mean, you hear that even now, and I find that very fascinating. How it's in your book, there's also ways in which you see like this as a layer of trauma, like why we say that among each other to each other about ourselves. So I think that's very interesting.
I mean, that's the other Armenians, isn't it? I mean, because there's even in this moment in the 1920s, this. I mean, as a historian, we all have these nationalist histories and theories to think about. How national identity is invented, and it's this modern Armenian identity, although you can go back to the Norzartank and to these different moments in history, they are kind of inventing an Armenianness in these homes, right? Because first of all, I mean, I disclose my grandfather didn't speak Armenian. He learned it from his kids and from his wife. He spoke Kurdish and Turkish, and he was a fedai in the ARF. He was a fedai during the war in Aintab. So he was a nationalist, but he didn't speak Armenian. So automatically there's this friction, right? But in these homes, they're actually teaching an Armenianness that includes the language, that includes, a kind of more uniformity to the identity that did not exist previously. And so it is a national project, and Yepe and the League definitely saw themselves as creating an Armenian community. They strove for an Armenian national home. They were using that language, which is identical to the Zionist project in Palestine. And she was using her home as an incubator for that. And so Armenians had to be taught how to do their arts and crafts that they had forgotten to do, the traditional stitches that they no longer remembered, how to make the threads for. And then, of course, the language. And it's a miracle of its own, but it comes at the cost of the dialects of the Armeno-Turkish that will be stigmatized in places like Aleppo, and in Lebanon. We have diaries in Armeno-Turkish from survivors, and some people have used them, but we're now more interested in them. But in the 1920s and 30s onward, they were trying to minimize and actually shaming. Armenians were shaming other Armenians who were not speaking pure Western Armenian. And so that's how these languages start to disappear, even though we have amazing texts and testimony in those languages that, unfortunately, I didn't tap. I know of one in Aleppo, but I didn't have access to it at this time because of the war and the conditions. But I would just say that a lot got lost in the course of that. So this internalized narrative of treachery, I mean, I don't know how we would think about it psychologically, Tamar, like, did Armenians sort of absorb the perpetrator logic, in the sense that Armenians were the fifth column in the traitors during the genocide, and then all of a sudden this becomes a sort of a dominant mode after the war.
But it's this fascinating kind of I'm going to bring in my personal interest, obviously, in the question of survival, right? And that thing that must survive at all costs. And we see here from what you're saying, as well as many of the narratives in the book, especially in that section on rescue, where and this goes into the second question that we wanted to ask you about how in some ways, the genocide, and of course the pogroms that came before it, right? The genocide was not a kind of like out of nowhere 1915 kind of event, like as we know, that those forms of violence on kind of in some ways like scapegoating or finding the Armenian community as a threat within the Ottoman Empire became a kind of signposting to Armenians that they must now define what Armenianness is, right? And it's that thing that now must be demarcated, it must be bounded, it must have its proper forms, its proper religious practice, traditions, family, and ways of reproduction, right? And it's through the bodies of women, especially rescued women, women who are seen as having to be rescued because they are the ones who will carry forward Armenianness from here on to ensure that the perpetrators project will not have been successful, right? So they have to be brought back into the fold, but then they also have to be habituated to this sense of a proper Armenianness. And we see in many of these, like you describe the ways in which women are brought in, they're taught, how to do the proper stitching. They're taught the songs and the language and how to do all of this in a way. So it's not just a kind of it is in some ways a saving. It's a rescuing of bodies from other communities. But it also in many ways is the production of a nation through those very bodies. And as we were just discussing, that production of a nation through those bodies is also traumatizing and re-traumatizing to those bodies who are now having to be brought into a fold to be disciplined in these proper Armenian ways. In some cases, having to be brought back into the Armenian community after having lived amongst other communities and living with that shame, right? And have to withstand constantly that shame. And so you use these terms, remembering, and I love the way that you work with language in this way. So there's the membering being members of a community, but the dismembering that took place during genocide, and the ways in which remembering is not just remembering, calling up memory, in other words, of those events, but also bringing those bodies back as members, remembering a community, which is not necessarily healing work. It's also very painful and traumatic for those bodies being remembered.
Definitely. Some people we don't have a great deal of these, but we assume everyone wanted to be Armenian again because this is so fantastic. And you come back and you become Armenian again, and it's great. There were kids that ran away from the home in Aleppo, and they were condemned. They were described as being just sort of lost projects or uncivilizational. They could not be civilized once again with some of the civilizational language that Danish humanitarian Karen Yappe used. And then I think a lot of this idea of civilizational rhetoric is also absorbed by Armenians. I mean, Armenians have largely absorbed also the Western humanitarian understanding of these tattoos, which is why I wanted to focus on them. But yes, it's painful. And remembering or reassembling, it's part imaginary, but it also becomes kind of, we could think of it as an internal missionary project on the part of Armenians too, to bring Armenians back in. And although some of these humanitarians from Europe were by and large secular, there were baptisms and rebaptisms and things like that happening in the community. And I think that's meaningful because it was about making them into Christians again, that tapped into older methods of missionary work. That was also why you have very violent reactions on the part of some Muslim communities in Aleppo, but also intellectuals in Constantinople are arguing that the Armenians are actually taking Turkish kids and making them into Armenians, kind of reverse or mirroring what had happened during the genocide. And Also feminist Halide Adib was one of those who was talking about this kind of laboratories of Armenians cannibalizing, kind of a cannibal imagery, that in Kumkapı in Constantinople, they're taking these kids and they're boiling them up in their cauldron to kind of dish them out as Armenians. It's really bizarre rhetoric, but it's fear of being consumed by the other. But surely, yes, this project came with its shame and a lot of pain. And the account that Melene told us about with the girl just sort of denying and denying, there are many accounts in the League records and also in some humanitarian memoirs of kids that would deny for weeks that they were Armenian before they would break down. But I think you could look at those accounts even more critically and say, well, what happened there? I mean, I'm just imagining you take somebody to a neutral house and you keep telling them they're Armenian for several weeks. Is it possible that mistakes were made? And I think it's Lerna Ekmektioglu, who I owe a huge debt of gratitude to for her work, points out the biopolitics of this, and that sometimes Armenians, noted in their editorials, she has a great example in her book, yeah, maybe a mistake was made here or there, but look what they did to us. So maybe we accidentally grabbed a Turkish kid here or there, but it's okay. I mean, look at what was happening to our children. So we got a few of theirs. So what? So yeah, it's a biopolitical project, and women are at the center of it. And I just think about these women, just affectively, how difficult it would have been to become a wife and have children after what they experienced. So when they show up in Aleppo, there's a doctor treating them in the home. I mean, they've got gonorrhea, they've been through it, right? And then they have to, and for the sake of the nation, get married, because the marriage is kind of baked into these projects, orphans marrying other orphans, and betrothals that are also happening abroad. These girls sometimes end up, in Canada, in the United States, and in France, and these places, married to men. And from the male perspective, and somebody in the community once said, well, look at our men. They took these women, even what they had gone through. But I'm thinking, these women were sexually assaulted repeatedly over and over, maybe even as children. And they go on to birth a new generation of Armenians. I mean, have we fully taken in what that meant to them and what their bodies had been through?
Yeah, like it's to in some way to undo genocide requires so much labor from women, right? It's like not just to have survived the genocide and all of the bodily atrocity that comes with that, but then to do all of the reproductive work physically, emotionally, and to give one's entire life to that pronatalist cause that Lerna Ekmektioglu also writes about. And then when you think about, again, the archive, how none of this is there, right? And the general, so there is this new feminist archive that scholars like you and Lerna and others are building now, but to imagine that after all of this work that was in some ways forced upon women, that it's been missing from the genocide narrative entirely up until very recently, is also really painful, right? To just think about.
Women and children died does not give you much information to understand the fuller story. I would actually share one. I'm publishing an article about a particular photograph that I learned more information about after the book was published, and it's a very difficult photograph to look at. It's a woman has her chest tattooed. She's unnamed in the Getty archive, but she has tattoos on her chest and is described as being pregnant, as having worked in a brothel, and she's often framed as a prostitute. I don't believe that, actually, but I later found her descendants. And so the article is kind of thinking through my previous analysis in light of having discovered her family members. So what I learned was that the mother of that woman, whose name is Miriam, she thought she had lost all her children in the genocide. So She later found her husband. And so can you imagine the family stories that they're on the boat to Ellis Island and they're actively working to have more children as they're making the crossing. And almost as soon as they arrive in the US, they're having more kids. So it's not unusual to find that pattern where people lost their children in the genocide and they're having a whole new family when they arrive, or wherever they arrive after the war, whether it's Aleppo, Beirut, or the United States. But just thinking about how, again, traumatic that was, and that it's that reproductive capacity of women that was also targeted in genocide. That's why they were abducted in the first place. They weren't taking in old ladies who couldn't have babies anymore. They were taking in productive, even if they had a child already in hand, they wanted the value of that woman's body in terms of surplus labor, domestic or maternal, is that she can produce. And I felt like that wasn't actually addressed, I felt, in Armenian genocide studies.
This is, I just want to say, this is, in a way, like a national policy in Armenia.
Mm-hmm.
In Armenia today, where, you know, after the 44-day war in 2020, that you have so many stories and cases of women who've lost sons, giving birth, again, through state programs as a way to almost recover what they've lost, and even naming some of these children with the same names as their sons. And it's I feel like it's a lot of sort of exploitation of women's bodies, and going back to sort of what you were talking about earlier, with these women kind of having this huge sort of like responsibility or burden, even, or expectation to reproduce the nation anew, and how, to me, that kind of comes back to the shame of like sort of what was trying to be covered in not speaking about the sexual violence that boys had experienced, which we know was the case. Let me see if I can frame what I'm trying to say. It's almost like it's almost like these women have to birth a new nation in order for the men who rely on the patriarchy to be able to keep their position within the Armenian, like, identity or Armenianness, or what was lost or what needs to be reconstructed.
Mm-hmm.
It's heavy.
Yeah, but I do see the patterns in the contemporary, you know, whether it's in Armenia or, I mean, I was thinking about Tamar's book too. I mean, homosexuals are targeted because they're not productive in that way, right? I mean, that's part of your argument in your book, Tamar, and it certainly tracks. I mean, we find also where there's really intense biopolitics in places like Israel, where there's actually high rates of abortion, because if there's any slight defect in the fetus, you have to get rid of it. And I believe also Armenia also has high rates of abortion as well, is it not?
Sex selective abortion.
Yes, sex selective. That's even more intense.
Armenia has the third highest rate, some parts of Armenia, of sex selective abortion in the world, next to China and India.
Wow.
I'm not sure if it's still the same statistic, but yeah, it has been that way for a while. But
yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think that's why I really wanted to analyze genocide as a manifestation of patriarchy. I don't even think genocide studies actually has fully grappled with that. There are some select scholars that have done great work to talk about why it is that genocide's targeting reproduction. And we know that, of course, that's embedded in the Genocide Convention, but rape is not mentioned in the Genocide Convention. It should be. And there's kind of a sort of targeting of what one scholar calls life force atrocity. That's how we should be understanding genocide. It's targeting life force. But life force is a double edge, as you've said, Melina. It's like also something states want. We have also in the US, of course, like trying to restrict abortion, and I'm assuming also birth control and other things as it faces demographic decline, and it's, not a growing population, and there's lack of children in the US actually. And instead of looking at it structurally, it's now like about actually trying to force women to force birth the nation.
To reproduce the Armenian patriarchy, to reproduce, in all of these instances, right, to reproduce the national patriarchy. And that remembering, and sorry if I'm harking on this for too much, but that I find to be, I found that to be such an important part of the book. The way in which you kind of point to the trauma of the remaking of the Armenian nation. So it's not the trauma is not just what happened in the genocide under the hand of the perpetrator other. It is also what happens within the remaking of the community, and that is traumatic to women, and it is traumatic to children, and it is all in the name of remaking an Armenian patriarchy that was also targeted during the genocide, right? So and the first, as you point out, and as has been a kind of, I think, more traditional genocide studies, if I might be wrong about that, because I'm not really an Armenian genocide studies scholar, but that it has been part of the kind of accepted narrative that it was actually men who were first targeted, because it was a kind of targeting of the community, and men were seen as like the kind of patriarchs, leaders of the community. So once you cut off the head of the snake, if you will, then the community will fall apart. But then, of course, after that, the women and the children were taken, kidnapped, mutilated, killed, and all kinds of other things. And to reconstitute the patriarchy that was originally targeted, it was an internal kind of taking of women's bodies to remake that patriarchy, and that is a really disturbing picture.
Yeah, I don't even know. I mean, although of the 250 Armenians arrested on April 24th, there were 2 women on the list, but only 2 out of like 250. So one was Zabel Yesayan, as you probably know. And unfortunately, she escaped one kind of, tyranny and fell subject to another in Armenia. But it's true. So yeah, unfortunately, the patriarchy reproduces itself. And I just felt like, honestly, the field had not really taken in, whether it's Armenian genocide studies or genocide studies more broadly. I don't think that we begin our definition of genocide by saying, okay, this is a manifestation of extreme patriarchy and this is how it works. That's not exactly where people start. They start with like the targeting of the community, but the community begins with the house. So then you have to explain, well, why is the so-called head of the household, the male, killed on the threshold of the door? Mm-hmm. Why did they pluck the beards of Armenian priests publicly? Mm-hmm. The plucking of the beard, what is a significant castration kind of gesture to castration publicly? Or sometimes it's an actual castration. I mean, there are many different figurative and literal and figurative ways that sexual atrocity was communicating the actual impotency of Armenian men to be able to protect their community. And but yeah, of course, the field is not what I've written. I have no idea how the field will receive it, but it was my interpretation based on older work I have done. Starting in the 16th century, what is the structure of a Muslim marriage? And how is it that Armenian women whose husbands are gone all of a sudden get the status of sahibsiz? They are without ownership. That's an actual category that's actually used. So there is an idea of marriage being proprietorship or ownership. It's embedded in all of the marriage contracts in the Ottoman Empire. So I felt like that longer view of sexuality and law, it really matters for us to understand how removing the male loosens up the non-Muslim female. Of course, the Muslim female is supposed to theoretically have a different status. They found workarounds for that too. They did enslave Muslim women on occasions, especially Circassian women or Cherkez women. But yeah, Armenian women without men, they're loosened up, and they're fungible properties that can be, kind of exchanged. That's why I like the Marxist feminist approach. A Marxist feminist reading of the Armenian genocide really illuminates why it is that these bodies were
Yes.
targeted the way they were. Because I gave a talk just last month for April 24th, and this man in the audience said, well, in the United States, they often just killed the indigenous women outright, right? They weren't necessarily interested in incorporating them into the household. Why was it different for Armenians? Those are the questions we need to ask. Like how, in some cases, no, these women are not actually good for anything. They need to be eliminated along with the men. But in other structures of genocide, they can become productive members of the family, and it is because of the structure of conversion and the structure of the Muslim patriarchal household that can usurp and take over and appropriate those bodies.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about tattoos, which is a major part of the book, and it's the cover you've chosen for the book is a woman with facial tattoos, and you uncover and bring back into the archive of genocide experience the practice of tattooing, which hasn't really been discussed within the genocide literature very much. And tattoos are an interesting archive. They're remnants because of the assumptions and associations that we have with permanent markers on the body by another, right? Tattooing. And this is where you write in the book that at first your kind of psychic leap was to think about the tattoo itself as rape, and you kind of originally had written tattoo rape as the way in which you were describing the tattooing process, because of the obvious ways in which the tattooing is linked to rape within our conscious or unconscious, whether rape actually occurred or not. And we don't necessarily know if the tattooing also came with other forms of bodily violation. But you then later, didn't use the concept of tattoo rape as you were writing out these chapters in the book. And we know of some cases where survivors who were tattooed do talk about how they were also sexually assaulted. But we also know of cases where some of the women deny having been sexually assaulted and are tattooed, and they outright deny that they were, but there's still assumptions even when they deny that they were, that, well, they must have been anyway. And you don't want to deny the fact that the tattooing is itself a violating practice, right? But you also leave it somewhat ambiguous. And I'm reading the ambiguity, and I'm reading a lot into it, but maybe I'm wrong. So can you talk a little bit about like tattooing and rape and that problem?
I'm going to start maybe from a different place, because what happened to me, when I went to Deir Zor, I went to Shaddadi, and there's a man that I interviewed for the book, maybe before I knew it was going to take this shape, named Saad, and he was an Islamized Armenian. So I met his mother, and she had a chin tattoo, and I have a beautiful photograph of her in the book from Catherine Cook, who's a photographer who was with me, and her tattoo on her chin looked like a cross. So we began asking her, well, tell us about your tattoo. And then she divulged that her Armenian mother had given her this tattoo. And that kind of blew my mind, because her Armenian mother tattooed her face and tattooed her body. It didn't match with the narrative I'd previously had. So mind blown. And then I asked Zahaya, do you have more? And she lifted up her dress, and she had 2 giant khachas, one on each thigh. And she said her mother had given them to her. And I realized her mother had been absorbed into this Muslim Arab household, but stamped her daughter as Christian. I mean, that's how I came to a different understanding that maybe there's more to what meets the eye when it comes to tattoos. And then I would also say, like, there's been in the last 15, 20 years a huge Kurdish, I would say, very feminist movement of Kurdish women who are embracing these tattoos as intangible Kurdish heritage. And then there's been publishing in Turkish on this matter. And as I looked into the cross, I found what a beautifully cryptic image, because the cross can also be a flower. The cross can, as shaped on these tattoos, could look like a lot of different things. So I started to think Islamized Armenians were placing these cryptic cryptic symbols on their skin. Is there something more to the tattoos? And then it also has, of course, a whole cosmology within Kurdish and Arab tribal culture. It can tell you tribal affiliation. It can be a blessing. And I started to ask, how does a blessing become a curse? And it becomes a curse when it's unwilling, when it's without consent. Because many women, and it's a rite of passage, I can talk to you about the tattoo ink and what's in it and what it symbolizes, but this is a rite of passage that happens at puberty, but that's also for Armenians from this very different world, encounter, which is Armenians who, under circumstance or under conditions of being abducted, being absorbed by force, being enslaved, in some cases working as domestic and sexual laborers in these houses, are being given tattoos at the time of puberty, around 13. And so 12 or 13 years old, depending, on the definition of puberty. So I would just say, like, there was more to what meets the eye, and I realized that for Armenian women, they're getting these tattoos without their consent. Within the narratives, I found a narrative from Ras Al Ain, Serpohi Tavuktian, who talked about how her tattoos served as a form of camouflage because gendarmes were coming through the neighborhood and would keep looking at her because she wasn't tattooed while everyone else was. So I have a remnant or a little source towards the end of the chapter on skin that talks about her experience, and she didn't like getting the tattoos, but she understood that it would offer her safety. And then you have the horrific case of Aghavni Kabakian, and that's a complicated case. When I was narrating it, I had already read two sections of her handwritten, not handwritten, but written by herself, her own memoir that she published in the Armenian Review. And then there was all these videos of testimony, and the way she described being held down and being tattooed by force as these women tied her down, because these are women practitioners. It simulated rape, and even though I had not read that she was raped, my mind automatically went there because of the violent nature of her tattooing. So to disclose this, what happened was I found out that there was an additional hour of recording only after my book came out. I went to Zorian Institute and I said, well, there's 3 hours of recording, and I found out that there was 4. And it's in the 4th hour of the recording, in her 4th hour of recording, that she describes that she actually was raped before this incident, before she was tattooed. And that then she immediately was removed from the household. So it seems as though the male patriarch had, in fact, raped her. And I got this completely wrong in my book. I apologized to Ryan Gingeras, who had also understood that she had been raped prior to the tattooing, and I apologized to him for having gotten it wrong, but it was because I had listened to 3 hours of recording, but not the 4th hour. So that is to say that for her, the tattoo and the rape are actually in the same kind of trajectory, and they're in the same moment. They're linked together. But the problem is, for Western humanitarians, for Western observers, they were understanding every woman's tattoos to be markings of slavery, slave brandings, to be marks of rape or sexual violence, evidence of, and especially evidence of contact with the other. And it's because they brought a kind of colonial interpretation of tattoos with them that had been developing for many centuries. The word tattoo itself is colonial. It's a Polynesian word. And so they brought with them this idea that people who get tattoos like this have been in contact with the other, and that also reinforces stigma. Dr. Mabel Elliott spent a lot of time in Constantinople, And she was a doctor. And of course, Armenie, as I list in my book when I talk about her, she becomes a nurse and she meets Mabel Elliott. And I can't help but think that contact with Mabel Elliott really intensified her feeling of stigma by this tattoo. She's adamant that she must have it removed. And she does get it removed in Constantinople. She begs an American doctor to quite literally cut them out of her face. Women were opting for the scars over the tattoos. And Mabel Elliott in her own book says women who have these marks have spent time in Turkish harems. That's why they have these tattoos. And so there was a huge amount of stigma of having been a former sex slave, if you will, in that mindset. And these women had to try to overcome it. And so eventually they turned to plastic surgery and these early methods of tattoo removal in order to remove the stigma, but not every woman could afford that. So I make a leap with the tattoo rape, and I thought I was catching myself. I thought that meant, like, psychologically, I was making the same leap that these humanitarians were making all the time, and I wanted to catch myself. But when I went back and revisited, I actually rewatched all 4 hours and realized after the book came out that I had gotten it wrong because I had missed the last hour of testimony, thinking that it was only 3 hours of recorded testimony. It was a COVID mistake, I guess, because I was watching it remotely. So what they would do is open up an interface like this and then zoom the recording to me. And when it stopped at 3 hours, I thought I was done.
But it's not just Ahavni's case, right? There's other cases too where it's left open, and there's one woman, Lucia, who adamantly denies that that they were forced on her, and she says that she chose to have them done as a child. She's not ashamed of her tattoos on her hands, and it's her granddaughter who who's a filmmaker who refuses to buy the story, like insisting that, like, no, if you have tattoos, you were forced to have them, right? And then you do this whole civilizational kind of narrative around tattooing as a savage act that, you know, the savages do. You trace it back to indigenous people in North America and the way in which women who had gone with indigenous peoples had been tattooed and then returned and then had to be re-civilized, and the way in which the tattoo marks that. And I think, I mean, aside from like a factual error with a lack of access to the full archive, I think that ambivalence, that ambiguity is an important part of the larger narrative here, especially speaking to some, you know, the way that you began answering this question of like the use of tattooing as a local, not necessarily an Islamic practice, but like a local cultural practice that allows one to belong to their local cultural practice, even as a Christian who's been Islamicized.
Yeah, completely. These are not Islamic markings. I mean, I love Suzanne Khardalian's film, My Grandma's Tattoos. And she does have this moment of friction with Lucia, and I wanted to analyze it because I felt like it was really, I mean, it's all of us that we come in with these assumptions, really, about tattoos that we've been taught. And it's because the community really hasn't done the deeper thinking or deeper work of unpacking some of these issues. You go to an event and they'll flash an image of a tattooed Armenian woman, and you mentioned my book cover, and you know, the book cover design was not my design. The image was, and the image is the fuller context. It's an amazing photograph of Lotfiye, who's in the opening, the introduction. And the context to that photo to me is more stunning than her face because she's beautifully dressed, and it tells you that she was a woman who took a certain kind of pride in herself. The opposite of what we think of when we think of a woman with a tattooed face. However, Lucia in that film, Grandma's Tattoos, is really trying to push against the dominant narrative we have in our community and just really can't be heard. I mean, the fact that she said we were kids, we did it to ourselves. And even her symbols are being interpreted as Turkish national symbols, like I see the Turkish flag Suzanne Hardalian says. And so her interpretation is sort of overriding that of the woman bearing the tattoos. So I felt that was productive friction, and got me back to where I was thinking about the tattoos, in Shaddadi with Zahaya and her cross tattoos on her thighs, and what's there that we're not seeing. So I was trying to use, it's like James Peacock, I think he calls it soft focus. Like, what does the backdrop look like? Thinking of photography techniques, what am I not seeing that's in the back, behind the subject, the sitting subject? And so those were some of the ways that I tried to at least offer ambiguity and suggestions of how we could view the photographs differently, because when it comes to activism, I want there to be an opportunity to take this to the public and for us to start thinking, how can we view these photographs differently, rather than seeing a victim of sexual assault, maybe seeing a survivor, or seeing those marks as part of the process that woman went through to get to the moment where her photograph was taken in a studio where she could reclaim whatever version of herself she wanted to be again. And so reading like Ariella Azoulai's Civil Contract of Photography and other texts of that sort, including Mariana Hirsch and Leo Spitzer's work on Holocaust post-memory, thinking how can we produce new afterlives for these photographs so that we don't have to stay trapped in the same dialogue. I could have perhaps, pushed it further, but I think this has to be a different kind of peer review. It has to go into the community. And I think it'll take a long time for community members to be able to listen. When I talk to people who aren't academics about my book, they often say, yeah, we know those women, they were assaulted, and then our men took them and they became wives. The end. So for them, they already know it's unresolved. I mean, it's completely resolved. It's the opposite. It's resolved. For me, it's less resolved because we haven't analyzed what that process looked like.
I mean, for me, as someone who's really fascinated by trauma studies myself, I find this actually a sort of it's very telling of how you keep referring to our community, but you're part of the community, we're part of the community, and there's a lot of, it was really difficult to read the book, but there were a lot of moments in which, and also with this ambiguity, like leaving things open, I think is really important to the healing process. And another thing that I kept thinking about throughout as I was reading is I was like, wait, during the same time, there were Armenians, other Armenias, even during that time, right? And you refer to, for example, Armenians in Calcutta, yes, you refer to Armenians in different Egypt, these are Armenians who did not have firsthand experience of the genocide, and there were other experiences of Armenians, and that really makes me feel really inspired and happy to know that was also the case, that and the fragmented way, the remnants, everything is so telling of Armenians sort of in a larger way of who Armenians are. And it was interesting to also see how this humanitarian kind of missions kind of try to frame an Armenian nation in one particular way, and then the other Armenians sort of taking that on, who didn't even experience this genocide. But of course, they experienced it through sort of the secondary and through the narration, obviously, but still, I think there's what your book is doing is resisting that, sort of a narrative continuing in the same way across time and into the future. So I find that really fascinating, and I'm really inspired by it and grateful for the work that you've done.
Thank you. I mean, I think what we learn when we look at Armenian mobilization, that this new story that Khachik Muradian is telling, and I learned about Rupen Harian's archive from Anna Alaksanyan, who wrote a very short piece, and I realized he collected every scrap of paper. It's the most unusual archive. He would write down notes on the back of a business card, and and save it. And it ended up getting archived in Yerevan. And he would write details, like small details. This is pre-internet. He would say, Siranush, she's a little overweight. She has blue eyes. She's 15 now. And she lives on this street in Der Zor. Like, they knew which street these girls lived on and whose houses they were in. They were internet before there was an internet. And they were doing it because Armenians are in Calcutta. Armenians, the ones in Cairo, I don't even tell their story. They're mass producing clothing and shoes and sending them to Syria and Lebanon for refugees with the AGBU. There's amazing humanitarian stories that are Armenians saving themselves. And the really eerie part of it is Armenians were really good at it early on. And in the Armenian genocide in the first year, too many Armenians were being saved by Armenians. Armenians were smuggling food into the deportation lines. They were sneaking doctors and nurses into the camps to treat people. And Armenians were surviving at too high of a rate. That's why they turned to more direct forms of killing rather than continuing the attrition, which is starving out and depriving, as a form of killing, because all these Armenians, older communities, ancient ones, including the one in Aleppo, I'm now working on the roots of the Armenian community in Aleppo and documenting what is unfortunately the likely disappearance of the Armenian community in Aleppo. There aren't many left. But that community is ancient, and of course they were culturally different, but they were mobilized and they were placing Armenians in their homes. Armenians had encampments inside the courtyard of the church, and the church was actually really central, but it wasn't the only church in town. There were Protestants, and there were also other Armenians that were, non-affiliated, that were helping. And so it's an amazing story. Because Armenians were so global, they were able to actually mobilize during and after the war to rescue so many people.
And part of that is also the prosthetic memory that you write about, which is closely related to post memory, which is the gathering of and the attachment to material objects that hold memories that are not necessarily yours, right? They're extendable to you. They belong to you communally, but they're not necessarily your memories or your family memories necessarily. And the way in which and I think about this all the time, the genocide really is a kind of event that marks Armenianness as a modern form of communal being that did not necessarily impact all of the Armenians that now find identification through it. And you also do that work in the book through the bones, which is the final section of the book, right? The going into the desert and the pilgrimages to gather bones that have been scattered along the desert in these sites of massacre, and placing them in communal sites of grieving and mourning. That in many ways is prosthetic memory. It doesn't necessarily, right? It doesn't, these are not the bones of one's own relatives, although in many cases people attach their own feelings of their relatives to the bones that they find. In some cases, whether those are human or not. Right. And it's that kind of that desire to remember, to bring back all of the members, the bones that belong. Right. And it's a fascinating section as well.
To reconnect.
Yeah. Materially.
I was going to say regarding prosthetic memory, I borrowed it from Alison Landsberg, who works on media and actually film. And there was something about this pretty profound Armenian writing culture. It includes photography and artistic works, but Armenians are writing so copiously. I mean, my big regret is that I didn't make this its own book, the bones part, because there was so much more to talk about. And I would just say, yeah, the material turn in history, turn more generally, but material turn also in history helped me get to a point of thinking about the materiality of bones. We know about these bone rituals, and it was really Peter Balakian's essays, again around 15 years ago, that reinfused this memory of what was really Levantine Armenians often going to Deir ez-Zor, or survivors in the case of some early pilgrims. But what you find is that there's just a long tradition of Armenian writing and also bone collecting. And the earliest bone collecting was by rescuer Rupen Haryan in 1919, who sends some bones to his relative in the United States, who he corresponds with. And then he does the very thing that I traced later. I found Rupen Haryan's letter much later in the process of writing, but he does exactly what modern writers do, which is they get the bones and then they start to imagine, to whom do these bones belong? And so it's really this affective engagement with bones. It's haptic. They're grabbing the bones. Not everybody does this, but those who do, they grab the bones and they start imagining, and sometimes see caravans of Armenians marching in front of them, or imagining the personalities to which the bones were attached once. It's often gendered, but Rupen Haryan imagines 3 different women to whom those bones might have belonged in his letter to Mirak, his relative in the U.S. But we also have prosthetic memory is post-memory, but it's embodied more. I wanted to talk about embodiment and engage the fact that I don't care whether these are accurate visions of the past. It's an anti-empirical turn on my part. It took me a long time to embrace this level of historical heresy. The idea that, I love archives, but I also love to hate them. So,
Yeah.
and I love the idea of creating something alternative, like what's happening with queer archives, like thinking of Majdaline Shamali's Between Banat, where it's all about reclaiming Arab lesbianism and like art and projects that are creating queer archives, oftentimes from peoples who are disentangled from their families, who have lost their lineages. It's very similar to genocide in this sense. People have lost lineages and they're creating their own, archival past, if you will, with their art. And I thought, well, okay, I really want to embrace just the affective quality of this and the fact that people are sense making out of something that's absolutely senseless. These are not scientific excavations. I do not believe there will ever be one in Deir ez-Zor or Ras Al Ain, even though other colleagues do believe that there's still a chance for that. But actually moving away from the empirical puts me in conversation with anthropologists. And because of the material turn that's affected our fields, but also the kind of anti-empiricism or self-reflection through autoethnography, which I know autoethnography can be overbearing and gross, I think sometimes, but I wanted to use it strategically to say, hello, I'm here. I have a subjectivity. I'm a historian and I've been trained to use the third person, but I'm going to remind you that I'm here once in a while. In order to trouble the idea that this is in any way an objective history. It's a history that's mine, that's yours. And mostly I wanted to use affect and blend all of these disciplines together to move people to care in a human time in which people care so little. That it's almost like the more we see the affective excess of it, we no longer care if we see a baby blown to bits, in real time. And so I wanted people to feel something in a time in which I think we're being desensitized and numbed. And that also includes making gestures of solidarity, which I think is the only path. I know we all agree probably with this, but the only path forward is that if something is to happen in Deir ez-Zor in the future, I would love to be a part of it. And that monument, that both of them that were destroyed were only built in 1990. But if there's going to be a new monument, I think it does have to recognize everything that's happened in Syria, including
Yes.
the mass killing of the Shaitat. And in the hundreds, I don't know, maybe even in the 500, 600 Shaitat were killed by Islamic State. The Yazidis were murdered. in the same region. There are at least 22 mass graves between Deir ez-Zor and Mosul as a result of Islamic State killing. Whatever happens there in the future, I feel needs to be a work of solidarity, and I would love to be part of that, because I think we can't look to states and we can't look to science to solve these questions. They have to be very human answers to these questions.
And in some ways that also like made me think about how the bones that are found there at this point, after a century of massacres happening in that desert, might be Armenian, might not be Armenian, right? But the fact that there are bones that have been produced out of massacre, right, that have been left there following massacre, makes them part of all of our human legacy, right? So they all matter, right? And this is I think, like, as an anthropologist, like I will say that the empiricism, especially in forensic anthropology, it makes one sick to the stomach, right? Because the work of anthropologists in war zones, usually it means trying to figure out whether those bones are American or not. And if they are not American, they can be discarded. If they are American, they are brought back home for a proper burial, right? And that should make every human being absolutely sick. And that is what empiricism often entails, right? Which is what you are refusing. It's the meaning. It's not whether the bone is really human or whether it's really mine or whether it's Armenian, or it's the meaning that one has and the kinds of affective invocations that might come in relationship to bones scattered in a desert.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's okay to disclose there. Lori Khachadurian has an amazing article coming out, and she's trained as an archaeologist, but there's long been a lot of archaeological digs in the same area where Armenians were mass killed during the Armenian genocide. And she has a case in Ras Al Ain called Tal Fakharieh. It's a hill. It's just full of bones. And for years, by years, I mean like 50, 60, 70 years, archaeologists were going there and just, they found bones, human bones, and they knew they were recent. They shoved them aside because they were really targeting the antiquities. So it's the violence of the practice. And I realize forensic anthropology can also have this completely different kind of, in terms of justice work and activism, thinking about I.L. Weissman's forensic architecture. They only do their work if they're invited by activists to do so. And that's really important, because what they're doing is using technology and science to restore evidence that can be used to fuel activists in their pursuit of justice. So I do think, though, that there's something about the material turn that I think can produce these new conversations, and I definitely want to be a part of that.
It's been so lovely to have you on, and just to talk about the book. And yeah, we just went in so many different directions, and it's also so relevant to the world today and to even the context here where I am in Armenia today. So really grateful to have you here with us, Elyse.
Thank you so much for taking the time, for taking so much time, and in the heat, the not unseasonal heat of Boston.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm sweltering over here, but thank you so much.
Thank you all for listening. Tune in next time, and please leave comments, like this video, subscribe to this channel, go to our podcast, the Other Armenians podcast, Ayl Hayastanet, can be found on most podcast apps. Please rate us on there, like us on there, follow us on there. And thank you all for listening. Bye, everyone.
Take care.